Inside Kansas's death row, who's still waiting to die? Welcome back to Justice Reversed. Today, we walk you through the most haunting cases in the state's death penalty history, where the sentences are final, but justice still feels unfinished. Number 1. Kyle Trevor Flack. A black suitcase floating in a Kansas creek marks the beginning of a discovery that would horrify even seasoned investigators. In May 2013, Franklin County deputies were called to the rural property of Andrew Stout, a man known for his generosity in letting people stay at his home. Concerned friends had arrived to check on him. What they found was a nightmare. In a nearby shed, under a tarp, was Stephen White, dead from a shotgun blast. Inside the house, detectives discovered two more bodies, Stout and 21-year-old Kaylee Bailey. But Kaylee's young daughter, 18-month-old Lana, was missing. Investigators quickly focused on 27-year-old Kyle Trevor Flack, a transient with a troubled past who had recently stayed at the property. He was located 2 days later in Emporia. In custody, Flack offered incoherent explanations. First, he mentioned a man named Omar had been involved, then said he owed drug debts, and finally blamed voices in his head. But his disjointed stories fell apart under forensic scrutiny. The turning point came on May 11th, when Lana's body was discovered in a creek, zipped inside a suitcase. She had been shot in the back. Her hands had been bound, her mouth gagged, and her glasses removed. The implication was chilling. She could not see what was happening, only hear it, feel it, and wait for the moment it ended. The other two victims, White and Stout, were both killed with a shotgun. But it was the calculated cruelty in Kaylee and Lana's deaths that emphasized. Flack was charged with murder for the deaths of mother and daughter, plus 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury convicted him on all major counts. His defense centers on mental illness. Diagnoses include schizoaffective disorder, major depression, and antisocial personality disorder. Flack's childhood was marked by neglect and abuse, but the court determined that these mitigating factors did not outweigh the extensive and planning evident in the crimes. 2 aggravating factors sealed his fate: the cruel method of Kaylee's murder and the deliberate killing of multiple victims. In 2024, the Kansas Supreme Court upheld the death sentence. While one justice dissented, pointing to Flack's ambiguous statements to police, even she described the evidence as overwhelming. Today, Flack remains on Kansas's death row, one of just 9 inmates in a state that has not carried out an execution since 1965. This case also serves as a grim reminder of preventable dangers. From what unfolded, we can draw several critical warnings. Know who you let into your home. Past instability and vague intentions often escalate. Mental illness must never be overlooked when children are nearby. Inconsistencies in a person's story aren't quirks, they're warnings. Take them seriously. Some crimes linger not only because of their horror but because of their silence. Kyle Flack didn't shout, didn't flee, he just killed, then watched the world trying to make sense of the void he left behind. Number 2. James Kraig Kahler. A rifleman crept into a farmhouse on Thanksgiving weekend, and what followed shattered 3 generations in minutes. The suspect? A father, a husband, and now a death row inmate in Kansas. On November 28, 2009, Osage County deputies responded to a call about a suspicious car outside the White residence. What they walked into was a massacre. Deputy Nathan Perling looked through the window and saw 89-year-old Dorothy White slumped in a pool of blood. Inside, her daughter, Karen Kahler, lay dead on the dining room floor. Upstairs, 16-year-old Lauren was barely alive, whispering, "Kraig, my dad, he shot us." She died shortly after. In the living room, 18-year-old Emily was already gone. The only child left unharmed was 10-year-old Sean Kahler. According to Sean, his father had walked in through the back door, shot his mother, and left like it was nothing. Kahler was arrested the next day in Shawnee County. He surrendered without resistance, reportedly telling officers, "I'm the man you're looking for. I messed up." What investigators found inside the home was described as a domestic battlefield. Kahler used a .223 rifle, firing with clinical precision. Witnesses testified that he chased his own daughter through the house before ending her life. Prosecutors called it premeditated vengeance. Kahler had recently lost his job, his marriage, and custody of his children after his wife entered a same-sex relationship. It wasn't a spontaneous breakdown, it was a calculated purge of those he blamed. At trial, Kahler's defense attorneys claimed he had suffered a psychological collapse. Diagnosed with major depression and narcissistic traits, they argued he had snapped. But the jury wasn't swayed. In just 2 hours, they convicted him on 4 counts of capital murder. The judge affirmed the death sentence. Kahler's appeal centered on Kansas's strict limits on the insanity defense. His team argued that state law unconstitutionally restricted mental illness defenses. The case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2020, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of Kansas, stating that the state had the right to define its legal insanity standards. Justice Breyer dissented, warning the ruling dismantled centuries of precedent protecting mentally ill defendants. Kahler remains on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility. His son Sean has pleaded for mercy, saying he's already lost his entire family and doesn't want to lose the only piece left. But for Karen's relatives, there is no closure, only replay. This tragedy is more than a family murder. It's a lesson in recognizing and responding to red flags before they explode. When resentment festers, it becomes a silent weapon. This case teaches us. Emotional breakdowns don't happen overnight. Pay attention to prolonged anger and withdrawal. High-conflict divorces with threats or control issues require active legal and mental health intervention. When someone expresses violence wrapped in despair, it's not a cry for help, it's a potential plan. Some fathers break rules. Others break hearts. But Kahler broke something deeper. He severed the thread that held his family together and left behind a legacy written in blood. Number 3. Justin Eugene Thurber. She left dance practice in her college sweatshirt, just like any other day. 4 days later, her body was found in a wildlife preserve, raped, beaten, and strangled. The man who took her life had been hiding in plain sight. In January 2007, 19-year-old Jody Sanderholm vanished from Arkansas City, Kansas. A dedicated student and member of Cowley College's Tigerette dance team, Jody never missed a commitment. When she didn't show up for a planned lunch with her parents, alarm bells rang. Her black Dodge Stratus was soon discovered submerged in a nearby lake. Days later, her body surfaced in the remote Call Wildlife area. Suspicion quickly fell on 27-year-old Justin Eugene Thurber. He was no stranger to the campus. Witnesses described him lurking around the college for months, often trailing members of the dance team. Some even claimed he had stalked Jody's younger sister as far back as age 13. Police arrested him the day after Jody's disappearance, initially for trespassing. But a search of his home revealed the clue that cracked the case, a pair of Adidas sneakers matching prints found near Jody's body. DNA evidence confirmed it. Thurber was her killer. Prosecutors described the murder as cold and calculated. Thurber had followed Jody after practice, abducted her, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her with a piece of clothing or cord. He discarded her body in the woods and drove her car into the lake to cover his tracks. This wasn't a sudden outburst of violence, it was the work of a predator. At trial, prosecutors argued that Thurber's history and actions met the legal standard for heinous, atrocious, and cruel, making him eligible for the death penalty. The jury took just 4 hours to convict and sentence him. One juror would later describe the crime as beyond comprehension. Thurber was sent to Kansas's death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility, one of just 9 men awaiting execution in a state that hasn't executed anyone since 1965. His case has become emblematic of the state's death penalty gridlock, justice promised, but indefinitely postponed. In the years since, Thurber's attorneys have claimed he is intellectually disabled, citing IQ scores between 70 and 80. In 2024, a judge ruled he did not meet the legal threshold. The Kansas Supreme Court is now reviewing what may be his final appeal. For Jody's family, the delay is a second trauma. Her father called it cruel, and her sister said the sentence marked not closure, but the start of a new nightmare. Jody's case leaves behind more than grief, it's a warning about what we miss. Here's what it teaches us. Stalking patterns must be reported and documented early. Hesitation can cost lives. College campuses need proactive threat monitoring, especially for repeat loiterers. Parents and students should learn how to recognize grooming behaviors and escalate concerns immediately. Because the danger isn't always sudden. Sometimes, it's been circling for months, waiting. Number 4. Scott Dever Cheever. A sheriff walked into the store to do his duty and he never came back out. And behind that is a horror that haunts all of Kansas. On a bitter January morning in 2005, Greenwood County Sheriff Matt Samuels arrived at a rural Kansas home near the ghost town of Hilltop to serve a warrant. Waiting inside was 23-year-old Scott Dever Cheever, armed, high on meth, and ready to kill. As the sheriff stepped forward, Cheever fired a .44 Magnum revolver. The shot was fatal. Samuels collapsed at the entrance. Before anyone could react, Cheever opened fire again, striking 3 deputies. They survived, but none would forget what happened. The house, owned by Darrell and Belinda Cooper, was more than just a rural residence, it was a meth lab. Prosecutors later called it a volatile drug den, and Cheever was its most volatile occupant. He was wanted on an outstanding warrant. Sheriff Samuels had come to make a lawful arrest. Instead, he became a casualty in one of Kansas's most shocking crimes. Cheever didn't deny the shooting, but his defense argued that methamphetamine had rendered him mentally incapable of forming intent. They claimed he was too intoxicated to understand his actions. That plea launched a courtroom battle that would stretch far beyond the borders of Kansas. The prosecution responded with testimony from forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Wellner, who said Cheever's behavior showed awareness and purpose. The jury believed him. Cheever was convicted of capital murder, attempted murder, drug manufacturing, and weapons charges. The sentence, death, plus over 700 months in prison. Cheever sat emotionless as the verdict was read. He became one of just 9 men on Kansas death row. But the case didn't end there. In 2012, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the conviction, citing a Fifth Amendment violation. Cheever had been evaluated by a state psychiatrist without having first waived his right to silence. The legal twist sent the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2013, Justice Sonia Sotomayor delivered a unanimous opinion. If a defendant raises mental incapacity as a defense, the state has the right to respond, even with court-ordered psychiatric testimony. The ruling reshaped how mental health defenses are treated nationwide in capital cases. In 2016, the Kansas Supreme Court reinstated Cheever's death sentence. Still, nearly 2 decades later, in 2024, he remains alive. His latest appeal claims his original defense was inadequate. No execution date has been set, and Kansas has not carried out an execution since 1965. Scott Cheever's crime left a sheriff dead, 3 officers scarred, and a courtroom history book rewritten. For many, justice still feels incomplete. And that leads us to what this case should never let us forget. Drug raids demand strategic preparation. Officers need intel, backup, and specialized support. Meth use doesn't excuse violence, but it escalates it. Early intervention saves lives. Legal systems must weigh mental health claims carefully without undermining public safety or justice. Because when a crime shoots through a community, its damage doesn't stop at one life, it echoes in law, in time, and in the silence of a badge that never got to retire. Number 5, Sidney Gleason. A robbery turned deadly, a witness silenced, and a legal war that shaped how Kansas handles the death penalty. In 2004, Sidney Gleason helped rob and stab a 76-year-old man in Great Bend, Kansas. His accomplice was cousin Damian Thompson. But the crime wasn't over. 19-year-old Mickey Martinez, who had witnessed the robbery, suddenly became a threat. Gleason feared she would talk. So he and Thompson made a plan. She had to disappear. That plan ended in 2 murders. On the night it happened, Gleason approached 24-year-old Darren Wernke, Martinez's boyfriend, while he was sitting in his Jeep. Gleason shot him multiple times, killing him instantly. Then, he and Thompson abducted Martinez. They drove her to a remote area. She was first strangled, then shot. Her body was dumped in the wilderness, a discarded secret. Investigators quickly pieced together what happened. Thompson turned on Gleason, telling police that Gleason stood by during Martinez's execution and never intervened. Both were arrested and charged. In 2006, a jury convicted Sidney Gleason of capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and criminal possession of a firearm. Prosecutors said his motive was chillingly clear: eliminate a witness. She knew too much, they told the jury. The sentence, death. But Gleason's case didn't end in the courtroom. Years of appeals followed, and the case eventually made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, claiming the jury instructions failed to clarify how to weigh mitigating factors like Gleason's rough childhood. The U.S. Supreme Court disagreed. In a 2016 unanimous opinion, Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that Kansas had gone too far. The Constitution does not demand that, he declared. The ruling reversed the state court's decision. The Kansas Supreme Court reinstated Gleason's death sentence in a narrow 4-3 vote. The case became a flashpoint in debates about capital punishment in Kansas. Justice Scalia criticized the state's high court for what he called an exasperating pattern of overturning death verdicts. The case even influenced political campaigns, with some citing it as proof Kansas courts were too lenient. Sidney Gleason remains on death row today at El Dorado Correctional Facility in administrative segregation. Nearly 2 decades later, his execution remains unlikely. Kansas hasn't carried one out since 1965, but his legal road appears closed. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear further appeals. He offered no emotion during sentencing. His jaw stayed clenched, his eyes forward. Neither apology nor outrage. These murders weren't random acts of rage. They were deliberate, calculated, and designed to bury a secret. And if they leave us with any lesson, it's this. Witnesses are often the next targets. Protection must start the moment a crime is reported. Trying to erase a crime only multiplies the damage. Cover-ups escalate consequences. Violence planned in silence is still premeditated. Lack of chaos doesn't mean lack of intent. Some cases aren't just about guilt. They ask how far a state will go to prove the law still matters. Number 6. John Edward Robinson Sr. He offered an opportunity, then delivered death. A polished liar with a predatory instinct, John Edward Robinson Sr. built a trail of bodies behind a facade of charm and respectability. Operating between Kansas and Missouri from 1984 to 2000, Robinson lured vulnerable women with promises of employment, shelter, or romantic companionship. His victims came from all walks of life. Many were seeking help, single mothers, job seekers, or those drawn into sadomasochistic relationships online. What they found instead was a killer hiding behind typed letters and online aliases. Among the known victims were 19-year-old Paula Godfrey, 21-year-old Isabella Luica, 27-year-old Suzette Troughton, and 19-year-old Lisa Stasi, who vanished with her infant daughter, Tiffany. Each woman was last seen with Robinson. Most had told family they were starting new jobs or adventures, but none ever returned. Suzette Troughton had moved from Michigan to Kansas after connecting with Robinson through a BDSM website where he called himself Slave Master. When her family received suspicious, typed letters claiming she was happy, while her pets were left behind and her phone calls stopped, they notified police. That call began the unraveling of Robinson's 2-decade killing spree. By 2000, Robinson had already served time for fraud. But in June of that year, following new allegations of sexual assault and theft, authorities searched his Kansas farm and Missouri storage units. They made a horrific discovery: 5 female bodies in barrels, beaten with a blunt object and sealed inside industrial containers. Investigators uncovered a chilling pattern. Robinson had used aliases to recruit women with job ads and online personal posts. He promised financial support, training, or relationships. Once isolated, his victims were manipulated, exploited, and murdered. In Lisa Stasi's case, he even forged adoption documents and gave her baby to his brother, claiming legal custody. In 2002, a Kansas jury convicted Robinson of capital murder in the deaths of Troughton and Luica. They also considered his manipulation of baby Tiffany and recommended the death penalty, warning that Robinson's psychological control posed ongoing risks, even behind bars. Robinson showed no emotion during sentencing. In Missouri, rather than face another death trial, Robinson pleaded guilty to 5 more murders, including those of Sheila and Debbie Faith, a disabled teen, and her mother. He received multiple life sentences without parole. After years of appeals, the Kansas Supreme Court upheld his death sentence in 2015, the first such ruling since reinstating capital punishment. Robinson, now 81, remains on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility. Lisa Stasi's daughter, Heather Robinson, who grew up unaware of her true origins, continues searching for her mother's remains. "I just want to bring her home," she says. Robinson's case changed how authorities view digital predators and offline trust. What this case warns us is chillingly simple. Always verify job offers, especially those from strangers online. When loved ones vanish after meeting someone, act fast. Predators often appear kind, not cruel. Grooming starts with trust, not threats. Charm isn't proof of safety. Sometimes it's bait. Number 7. Reginald Dexter Carr Jr. v. Jonathan Daniel Carr. They didn't just commit murder, they dismantled a house full of dreams, then walked away into the snow. What happened in Wichita in December 2000 still haunts Kansas today. It began on December 8th. 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber was robbed at gunpoint. Days later, librarian and Valenta was shot during a carjacking. She would die 3 weeks later. But the full extent of terror would erupt on December 14th on Birchwood Drive. Inside a modest suburban home, 5 young people were spending the evening together. Brad Heike, 27, Heather Muller, 25, Aaron Sander, 29, Jason Beffert, 26, and Holly G., Heather's girlfriend. The Carr brothers broke in with guns and chaos. What followed was hours of humiliation, rape, and psychological torture. The victims were forced to strip, engage in sexual acts, and endure calculated cruelty. Then, in the early morning hours, the brothers marched them outside, naked, barefoot, into the snow. They were lined up and shot in the back of the head. 4 died instantly. Miraculously, Holly survived. A hair clip deflected the bullet. Bleeding and frostbitten, she walked over a mile in the freezing dark for help. Her eyewitness testimony would become the linchpin of the case. Investigators pieced the trail quickly. Schreiber and Valenta's attacks had left physical clues. A neighbor recognized Jason's truck, and Valenta, before passing, identified both men. Reginald Carr was arrested in Wichita. Jonathan was caught days later at his girlfriend's mother's house when holding Jason's engagement ring. Both men came from troubled homes, physical abuse, neglect, and addiction. Jonathan had attempted suicide as a teen. Reginald had a long history of violent behavior. Still, prosecutors argued their upbringing did not excuse their actions. They called the crime spree a study in premeditated cruelty. In 2002, a jury convicted both brothers of capital murder, rape, kidnapping, robbery, and more. They were sentenced to death. In court, neither flinched. The legal battle stretched on. In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the death sentences due to jury instruction errors. But in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously reinstated them. And in 2022, Kansas's High Court upheld the convictions again, despite dissent from Chief Justice Marla Luckert, who warned that the trial was riddled with error. Today, the Carr brothers remain on death row in Kansas. Their final appeals are pending. Yet their story endures not just because of its violence, but because of the silence that surrounded it. National media largely ignored the massacre, sparking debate over racial and narrative bias in news coverage. And it leaves behind a lesson that should never fade. Violence rarely starts with murder. Small acts of control or aggression often come first. When people exhibit degrading or dominating behavior, it's not just a red flag, it's a warning shot. Survivors' testimonies are sacred. Listen to them, amplify them. Sometimes, some crimes don't just stain the snow. They stain the silence that allowed them to happen. Number 8. Gary Wayne Kleypas. A college town, a quiet apartment, and a crime so brutal it changed how Kansas understands justice. In 1996, Carrie Williams, a 20-year-old education major at Pittsburgh State University, was just weeks away from graduation. She had dreams of becoming a teacher, shaping lives with compassion and purpose. But those dreams were cut short by someone who lived just blocks away, Gary Wayne Kleypas. Kleypas, also enrolled at the university, was no ordinary student. His academic record was littered with behavioral issues, and his personal history showed signs of instability and cruelty. On the night of March 1996, he entered Carrie's apartment uninvited. What followed was a sequence of horrors the state would never forget. Carrie was raped, beaten, and stabbed 7 times. Her wounds indicated prolonged suffering. Prosecutors described the killing as heinous, atrocious, or cruel, the threshold required for the death penalty in Kansas. Kleypas was arrested shortly after the murder. In 1998, a Wyandotte County jury found him guilty of capital murder, rape, and aggravated burglary. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Judge Donald Noland agreed, sentencing him to die. But the legal journey was far from over. In 2001, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned Kleypas's death sentence, ruling that the state's death penalty statute had constitutional flaws. A retrial was ordered. The case was relocated due to pretrial publicity, and in 2008, a new jury once again sentenced Kleypas to death. During that resentencing, tensions ran high. Carey's father lunged at Kleypas in court, unable to contain his grief and fury. Defense attorneys claimed this compromised the fairness of the trial. The judge, however, determined that order was restored swiftly and the proceeding remained legally sound. In 2016, the Kansas Supreme Court reviewed the case again. While they reversed a separate attempted rape conviction, they upheld the death sentence. Justice Lee Johnson dissented, arguing the death penalty itself violated the state's protections against cruel and unusual punishment. That same year, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Kleypas's appeal, leaving the sentence intact. Yet, in 2022, a new twist emerged. The Kansas Court of Appeals ruled that Kleypas's post-conviction petition had been dismissed without evaluating his competency. The case was reopened, and that hearing remains pending nearly 3 decades after Carey's death. Today, Kleypas remains at El Dorado Correctional Facility in administrative segregation, Kansas's version of death row, marked by near-total isolation. He shows no remorse, and the legal process grinds on. Carey's family, though largely silent, continues to be present at court. Their grief remains a quiet but powerful presence, one that outlasts headlines and hearings. Carey's murder wasn't just a legal turning point, it became a personal wake-up call for anyone who believes their safety is guaranteed. And from that silence, these lessons emerge. Familiar environments are not always safe, instinct and caution must guide daily choices. Justice may take years, but persistence by victims' families ensures the crime is never forgotten. Safety isn't a guarantee, it's a daily act of awareness. Some crimes don't just rewrite laws, they rewrite our definition of safety, home, and how far we must go to protect them. These are the men still waiting on Kansas's death row, names you may not hear often, but stories you'll never forget. Each case etched into legal history, each sentence a reminder that justice in America doesn't always come swiftly or clearly. Which case shocked you the most? Which story do you think deserves deeper investigation? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more real stories from the darkest corners of the justice system, true crime that's 100% factual, no fiction, no fluff, don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reversed and hit the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. Because in these stories, silence doesn't mean peace, it means there's still more to uncover.